Listen to part of a lecture in an art class.
The vast majority of painters rely either on watercolors or oil paints to paint with. These two paints have some differences though. Historically speaking, both types of paints have been around for centuries. Watercolors, however, are much, much older than oil paints.
How old are watercolors, Professor Daniels?
Okay, what is this part about? What is the topic going to be? The professor is talking about the majority of painters using watercolors or oil paints, okay? And he added that watercolors are much older than oil paints. Let's move on. Hold on. The vast majority of painters rely either on watercolors or oil paints to paint with. The vast majority. What does vast mean? Vast means extremely large, okay? Majority. Majority means a large number, a large part, a large proportion, okay? Usually more than half of that group. Rely either on, either or, that means A or B, okay? Either A or B means A or B, either or. Rely on, what does that mean, rely on? Rely on means something needs something else, or something depends on something else to do a work properly or to live, alright? Rely either on watercolors or oil paints to paint with. These two paints have some differences though. What does though mean? Though means but. These two paints have some differences though, is same as, but these two paints have some differences, okay? Historically speaking, both types of paints have been around for centuries. Historically speaking, what does that mean? It means, if I say it historically, okay? Both types of paints have been around. What does it mean? Have been around. Have been around means it was present, okay? For centuries. What's a century? Century is 100 years. Cent means 100. There are 100 cents in $1, and what else? 100 centimeters in 1 meter, okay? Century is 100 years. Watercolors, however, are much, much older than oil paints. Watercolors, however, what does however mean? You use however when you want to talk about something that contrasts what you have just said. So, however, it's like but. But watercolors are much, much older than oil paints.
How old are watercolors, Professor Daniels?
Well, let me put it this way. Primitive men used watercolors to create cave paintings thousands of years ago. That's how old they are. Still, watercolors in their modern form were not created, or perfected, I should say, until many years later. This happened during the 18th and 19th centuries in Great Britain. As for oil paints, well, there's a text from Greece that mentions them being used in the 5th century, and some form of oil paint was used in Japan in the 8th century. However, oil paints as we know them today were invented in the 15th century by Jan van Eyck.
Okay, what is this part about? This part is about how old these paintings are, okay? Watercolors were used by primitive men on their caves thousands of years ago, okay? but the colors of the modern form were perfected, okay, during the 18th and 19th century in Great Britain. And for oil paints, okay, there's a text from Greece that says it has been used in the 5th century, and some of the oil paints were used in Japan in the 8th century, okay. But the oil paints, as we know today, were invented in the 15th century by Jan van Eyck, okay. Well, how old are watercolors, Professor Daniels? Well, let me put it this way. What does that mean? Put it this way. Let me put it. Means let me say it in this way. Primitive men used watercolors to create cave paintings thousands of years ago. Primitive men. What does that mean, primitive? Primitive means belonging to a society, living in a simple way. People living in a simple way, and usually not having any industry or a writing system, okay? That's being primitive. Primitive men used watercolors to create cave paintings. What's a cave? Cave is a large hole in the side of a cliff or hill, okay? Or underground. Cave paintings thousands of years ago. Thousands of years ago means what? It means 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, but not 10,000, okay? And not 1,000 either, right? That's how old they are. Still, watercolors in their modern form were not created. Or perfected, I should say, until many years later. Still, what does that mean, still? Still means same as but. But watercolors in their modern form were not created. Modern form, what does modern mean? Modern means relating to present time, okay? Modern form were not created. What is a form? Form is a shape or a kind of something, alright? Or perfected, I should say. What does that mean, perfected? Perfect something means to improve it, okay? Improve something as good as it can possibly be, okay? Until many years later. This happened during the 18th and 19th centuries in Great Britain. This happened during, what does during mean? During means at the period of, okay? 18th and 19th centuries. What is the 18th century? 18th century is 17 something. Do you understand? Look, when's the first century? First century is from year 1 to year 100, and the second century is when? From year 101 to year 200. So 18th century will mean 17 something, alright? 18th century and 19th centuries in Great Britain. Great Britain is the United Kingdom, right? It consists of what? England, Scotland, Wales, alright? As for oil paints, well, there's a text from Greece that mentions them being used in the 5th century. As for, what does that mean? As for means regarding, talking about. As for oil paints, regarding oil paints, there's a text from Greece. What's a text? Text is a written material, alright? From Greece that mentions, what does mention mean? Mention means to say something briefly, okay? Mentions them being used in the 5th century. So it's 400 and something, all right? And some form of oil paint was used in Japan in the 8th century. However, oil paints as we know them today were invented in the 15th century by Jan van Eyck, okay? Oil paints as we know them today were invented. What does invent mean? Invent means to think of something for the first time or make something for the first time, okay? Okay, let's go to the next part.
By Jan van Eyck. Okay, but let me get back to their differences now. Basically, there's one major difference. It's the transparency of the paints. The pigments in oil paints are, they're opaque, but it's the opposite case for watercolors. The result is that painters using each medium must employ different styles. For instance, an artist using oil paints can simply paint one opaque color over another until he gets the desired result. Watercolor artists, however, are unable to do this.
Okay, what is this part about? This part is about the features of the oil paint and the watercolors, okay? So, what is the feature? Oil paints are opaque, okay? And watercolors are the opposite, okay? So, and then the professor talks about, as a result, how to use those paints, okay? For oil paints, you can just paint the color over another, okay, to get a result. But for a watercolor artist, you can't do that. Let's see what this means. But let me get back to the differences now. Basically, there's one major difference. Basically, what does that mean? Basically means simply and importantly, okay? There's one major difference. What does major mean? Major means more important than others in a situation. It's the transparency of the paints. Transparency. What is this? Transparent means if an object or a substance is transparent, you can see through it, okay? The pigments in oil paints are opaque. The pigments, what's a pigment? Pigment is a substance which gives color to another substance, alright? The pigments in oil paints are opaque. What does that mean, opaque? Opaque means you can't see through it. It's the opposite of transparent, okay? But it's the opposite case for watercolors. It's the opposite case. What does opposite mean? Opposite means being at the farthest place from you. Do you understand? And it means opposite means very different, something of the same kind being very different. This is opposite, okay? But it's the opposite case for watercolors. So that means watercolors are not opaque. That means it's transparent. The result is that painters using each medium must employ different styles. The result is that, what is result? Result is what you get after, in the end, okay? What you get in the end is a result, okay? The result is that painters using each medium, what's a medium? Medium is something that you use to do something else, okay? Medium means middle, so why is it called medium? If you use something to do something else, that thing is in the middle, right? So that's why you call it a medium, okay?